Hey, Matt here, and today I want to talk about three super common mistakes I'll see with weak point training. So I'm curious to hear if you make these. These are more common than you'd think. So with powerlifting, there's the idea that when you miss a lift, we'll commonly hear the mantra of a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And there's definitely some merit to that, right? So let's talk about the three most common things we see and where to use weak point specific training in your powerlifting programs. So first and foremost, the most common place I'll see weak point training misused is training at the point of failure or at the sticking point. So for example, we'll commonly see lifters where they'll train a bench press and 4 inches off the chest or 10 centimeters or so they'll miss. And the problem with this, with training just that point, is that's where you miss. The bar has to decelerate to that point. So when we're looking at the velocity or the bar speed, right? So we've got time here and velocity here. So from the chest, right? The bar is at pretty well zero velocity. It's paused, right? And then as you start to press, you're going to accelerate quite quickly and then decelerate. And on a missed press, you'd probably end up with something like that, right? Press, slow down, and it keeps slowing down past that point of no return, and you miss. Now, if we were to compare this against a successful press, we'd probably see something like this, where you come up still, and you're able to pretty well maintain velocity until you finish the press, right? Something along those lines. These are obviously not to scale or anything, but it's meant to illustrate a point. So when we do this, there's that point in our initial press where we decelerate. And what will happen here is that's about 4 inches off the chest right here, and then 2 inches or so. And you can see that's kind of where, in our theoretical example, we start to decelerate. Especially in bench press, velocity matters. And if the bar slows down to a stop, you're not going to keep moving towards the top. So the idea with this being, go to the point before where you miss so you can identify where the bar is actually slowing down. If you have a tool like a Tendo, they're really, really useful. Otherwise, you can always just look on your video, or for simple rules of thumb, 1 or 2 inches before that point where you're going to miss. Okay? So taking your pin presses, if you're going to do them to identify 4 inches off the chest, or block pulls if you're weak, somewhere before lockout in a deadlift, you can use these tools, but take it back in the range of motion to the point where you start to decelerate, not the point where you miss. Second mistake I'll see in weak point training is underuse of accommodating resistance. So accommodating resistance, for those who aren't familiar, is use of bands, chains, and the idea being, as you go further through the range of motion, the resistance, the load on the bar actually changes, right? As you stretch out a band, it fights you a little more. As you lift more and more links of a chain off the ground, it's heavier. So in terms of range of motion training, accommodating resistance is pretty self-explanatory. If it's heavier at the top and it's lighter at the bottom, it's going to really emphasize top end strength. So lockout on a bench press, lockout on a deadlift. This stuff is pretty popular. It's pretty well used. That's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about it more in terms of velocity development and technique development. So when, as a lifter, you know that, for example, you walk out a squat and holding that squat at the top is not particularly challenging. And you know that basically once you're past your sticking point in the squat on the way up, it gets easier and easier as you go. So you can in some ways relax, or maybe just simply not produce maximal amounts of force. From a force development standpoint, you're slowing down at that point. Your velocity on the bar is actually coming down. And by itself, maybe not a huge issue, but in terms of overall result in training, if you want to maximally recruit as many muscle fibers as possible, trying to have as much force going through the bar is ideal. So with that in mind, we can use accommodating resistance to develop that. So instead of having a squat where you come up and past that sticking point, it gets easier and easier. With accommodating resistance, we can set that up to where it gets harder and harder the further up you go, until you've got this super maximal load at the top and submaximal load at the bottom, right? So now what used to be the easy point where you could relax, you've actually got to be stiffer and tighter for, and for developing that brace and technique and consistency with always applying maximal force, accommodating resistance can't be beat. You can push really hard against an imaginary weight that you can move faster. But if you're always used to just pushing as hard as you can through the movement and developing as much speed and power as you can, there's huge merit to that, not just in terms of having the bar move quicker, but also keeping your technique more consistent rep to rep, because you're always keeping as stiff and tight as you can, applying maximal force to the bar always. So last piece is too much weak point training. And now I realize this sounds maybe a little bit backwards with the idea being weak point training mistakes, but I think one of the most common things we'll see with weak point training is people overusing it. Yes, there's absolutely merit to the idea of training the weakest link in the chain, but if that's all you do, you're never going to hit any PRs, because you're spending time with weak links and weak lifts and weak muscle groups and weak ranges of motion, and the loads you're using on that are lower. They're not going to be what your PRs are, right? So generally speaking, I try to look for a 1-to-1 ratio of playing to your strengths and developing weak points. So if we were to put this into an example, I would say something along the lines of a deadlift. Let's say you pull sumo and you're weak off the floor, right? So we could use a conventional deadlift or a deficit deadlift as a way to develop that strength off the floor. And then we could use block pulls as a way to sort of play to your strengths, give you something you're really good at, and use some super maximal loads and just sort of really strengthen. Heck, we could even use accommodating resistance, right? But the idea with it being we have a bottom end focus where we're weak, and then we have a top end of the range of motion focus where we're stronger and we're going to get used to handling some heavier weights. And the idea with this being you're still definitely spending some time developing where you're weak, but you're also spending time developing your top end strength. And frankly, powerlifting is about top end strength. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a 1-rep max contest. If you have any questions about this, I'd love to hear your feedback or just comments overall. And just remember 3 things to watch out for with your weak point training. Sticking points, we want to go a little bit below them. Using accommodating resistance where it's appropriate. And then finally, not having too much weak point training. If you want to see some of these principles in action, I've got a free 10-week hypertrophy program intended to help build a base and iron out some of the imbalances we see commonly come up in powerlifting. We use a little bit of some of the concepts in this presentation to build up some of your weak points and build you out as a more well-rounded lifter. If you're interested in that, you can comment program below and I'll get in touch, get you a copy. Thanks. Talk soon.